Welcome to Endless Stories channel. Subscribe to stay updated with all the latest. Part 1. He was a man of 45, a poor fisherman living in a small village nestled close to the water's edge, where the waves kissed the soft sand and left behind broken shells and fleeting white foam. His body was lean, weathered by the sun, and his hands rough from years of handling nets and ropes. 7 years ago, he had lost his wife, the light of his soul, leaving him with 3 young daughters yet to marry. He never considered replacing her, his heart still tethered to her memory, as if she lingered in the corners of their humble mud hut. He resolved to dedicate his life to raising his girls, working tirelessly to provide what little he could. Each day, as dawn broke, he gathered his net and set out in his small, rickety boat, leaving his daughters in the care of the eldest, whose eyes carried a mature sadness beyond her years. The water was both his ally and adversary, sometimes granting him sustenance, other times withholding it. One day, he returned from a long, grueling fishing trip with nothing but a handful of small fish, barely enough to ease their hunger. He placed them before his eldest daughter and said in a weary yet gentle voice, "Prepare these for us to eat, my dear." He always waited until the girls had eaten, then took whatever scraps remained, if any, and if nothing was left, he raised his hands to the sky, thanking God for what was given. After their meal, he would sit with his daughters on the creaky wooden bed and begin telling stories. His voice turned magical as he recounted tales of the jinn who served King Solomon, peace be upon him, and the wondrous ring that commanded everything, even the wind and sea. He spoke of the fish that swallowed the ring and sank into the depths, leaving behind a mystery unsolved. The girls listened with wide eyes and slightly parted lips, captivated by the wonder. One night, the youngest raised her head and asked innocently, "Father, can you catch Solomon's fish with the ring inside it for us?" He smiled softly and replied, "God willing, my little one, may he bless us with something even greater." The next day, he rose before dawn as usual. But the sky was different. The wind howled like hungry wolves, and a thick white fog shrouded the water. Despite the silent warnings in his eldest daughter's eyes as she watched from the doorway, he refused to return empty-handed again and set out. He sailed in his frail boat, battling waves that crashed against its sides. He didn't know that fate had something unimaginable in store. As he cast his net, a sudden storm struck, flipping the boat and plunging him into the depths. He fought the water, flailing his arms, but the cold and darkness swallowed him. He thought it was the end. Then, a golden light pierced the underwater gloom. He forced his eyes open, and there she was, a sea fairy, her golden hair glowing like a small sun beneath the waves, her eyes shimmering with a hue he'd never seen. She approached as he struggled to breathe, then placed her hand on his head. Instantly his lungs filled with air, as if the water were no longer his enemy. She spoke in a voice as soft as a stream. "What are you doing here?" He couldn't answer at first, but she took his hand and dove deeper, pulling him into a strange ship resting on the ocean floor, covered in algae and shells. Inside the ship, he stood in awe, breathing underwater as if on land. He looked at her and said, trembling, "How is this possible? I'm breathing and talking to you." She smiled and replied, "I know you well, though you don't know me. I've watched you for a long time. You're a good man, caring for your daughters, loving your wife even after her passing, never seeking another." Confused, he listened as she continued, "I'll give you what you desire, but on one condition. Tell no one what you've seen. This is our secret. If you reveal it, you and those you love will face a curse and punishment." He asked, "What do you want from me?" She said, "My father, the ruler of the sea, wants to marry me to someone I don't love. If you help me, I'll help you." He questioned, "How can I help you?" She replied, "Marry me." His heart stopped for a moment. "How can I marry you? You're a fairy, and I'm human." She said, "It doesn't matter. Your marriage to me will stop my father from forcing me into that other union. You'd be saving me from a torment I dread." He hesitated, but with no other choice, he agreed. The marriage took place that day in the strange underwater ship, in a way he couldn't comprehend, yet it felt as real as the life he knew. Meanwhile, on land, the mud hut trembled under the storm's fury. The three girls huddled together, peering through the broken window, shivering with cold and fear. Rain seeped inside, and the wind battered the frail walls. The eldest tried to calm her sisters, but her eyes searched the darkness for her father, hope fading with each gust. Beneath the sea, after the marriage, the fisherman said to his new wife, "I need to return to my daughters." She looked at him sadly and said, "But I've come to love you. Stay with me longer." He replied firmly, "I love my daughters more. I haven't fallen for you. I'm only helping you. Now help me get back to them." She sighed and said, "Wait until the storm calms. I'll show you the way out and give you treasures I find in the sea." When the wind subsided, she handed him a small sack of ancient gold coins and said, "Take this, but keep our secret." She guided him out of the water to a distant spot where no one could see, and he emerged. He returned to the hut with fish and the sack, greeted by his daughter's cries of joy and tears. The eldest, holding a gold coin, asked, "Father, where did you get this?" He nearly told her about the fairy, but remembered his promise. "I found it when the boat overturned, my dear," he said. The girls prepared the food, and the next day he sold the coins in the market for a hefty sum. He bought enough provisions to last weeks and began repairing the hut, but something inside him had shifted. The sea called to him, a longing he couldn't explain, pulling him back to the fairy he'd left behind. Part 2. The fisherman returned to his mud hut after selling the ancient gold coins in the market, his arms laden with more food than his daughters had ever seen. Sacks brimmed with rice, lentils, and fresh vegetables, and he even managed a small piece of meat from a kind-hearted trader who lowered the price upon seeing the joy in his eyes. The hut began to change little by little. The broken window was patched with a fresh plank of wood, and the leaky roof was covered with thick straw he'd bartered from a neighbor. For the first time in years, he felt he could offer his girls a better life, though it was still far from the comfort every father dreams of providing. Yet something gnawed at him from within. Whenever he closed his eyes, he saw her golden hair swaying beneath the waves, heard her soft voice echoing in his ears. The sea fairy, his secret wife, had left an imprint he hadn't anticipated, a strange yearning for the water he'd never felt before. In the nights that followed, he sat with his daughters as usual, spinning tales, but his mind wandered at times to that sunken ship in the ocean's depths and the vow he'd made to keep silent. The youngest noticed his distraction and asked, "Father, why do you pause in the story?" He'd smile and continue, but his heart knew something had altered within him. A few days later, he could no longer resist the pull. The sea seemed to whisper his name, urging him to return. One sunny morning, he readied his little boat and said to his daughters, "I'll be back before dusk, don't worry." But this time, fishing wasn't his only aim. He sailed far until he neared a small, deserted island, tied his boat to a jutting rock, and slipped into the water, moving as if guided by instinct. He dove shallowly, and within moments a soft hand grasped his and pulled him downward. It was her, the sea fairy, waiting with eyes that shimmered with both longing and sorrow. Inside the submerged ship, they sat together. She placed her hand on his head again, granting him breath beneath the waves as before. She said, "I missed you. I didn't think you'd return so soon." He replied, his voice tinged with hesitation, "I don't know why I came back, but I felt I had to." She smiled and said, "Perhaps because you're now part of my world, and I'm part of yours." He spent hours with her, over 5 hours, talking and exchanging glances. She told him of her realm beneath the sea, of coral palaces and sunken treasures no human eye had beheld. But despite the enchantment of her words, his heart remained anchored to his daughters on land. As night drew near, he said, "I must go back. My girls are waiting." She tried to persuade him to stay, but seeing the resolve in his eyes, she relented, handing him fresh fish and saying, "Take this, and I'll wait for you again." He emerged from the water, returned to his boat, and sailed home. He reached the hut after sunset, met by his daughter's mix of worry and relief. The eldest asked, "Father, why were you so late?" He set the fish before her and said, "I was searching for better provisions for you all." It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. The pattern repeated in the days that followed. He'd set out to fish, but no longer returned early as he once did. He lingered longer beneath the waves with the sea fairy, listening to her tales, coming back with fish and occasional gold coins she gifted him. He began buying more food for his daughters, filling the hut with enough to last weeks. Hunger no longer haunted them, and smiles brightened their faces more often. But the eldest started to notice something odd. Her father returned more exhausted than he should, his eyes carrying a distant look, as if gazing at something she couldn't see. One night, as he narrated a tale of King Solomon, the youngest interrupted, "Father, have you found the ring's fish yet?" He paused, then said, "Maybe someday, my little one." But he knew what he'd found beneath the sea was stranger than any ring they'd heard of. He tried to live 2 lives, the poor father on land and the secret husband underwater. The burden of the secret grew heavier, and a quiet fear of its exposure crept into his heart. Meanwhile, beneath the sea, all was not as calm as it seemed. The king of the jinn, the fairy's father, began to suspect his daughter. He wasn't pleased with her frequent absences or the whispers that reached him of her marriage to a human. The king was an old, stern figure, with eyes like embers and a power that bent the waves to his will. One night he sent soldiers to watch her. They saw her meet the fisherman and retreat with him to the sunken ship. The soldiers reported back, and the king's fury erupted like fire in the ocean depths. He resolved to put an end to it. The next day, the fisherman set out as usual. The weather was calm, the sun casting golden rays across the sea's surface. He dove to meet his wife, unaware of the eyes tracking him from afar. When he reached the ship, she greeted him with a warm smile, but moments later, a deep roar shook the depths. The king himself had arrived, surrounded by his guard, wielding a red coral staff that glowed like blood. He glared at his daughter and thundered, "What are you doing with this human?" She tried to respond, but he didn't wait. With a gesture, his guards seized them, binding them with strong seaweed ropes. The fisherman struggled, but his strength was nothing against the jinn. His fairy wife cried out, "He's my husband, and I'm carrying his child." The king froze, then laughed bitterly. "Impossible. You're no daughter of mine if this is true. I'll kill you both." The fisherman fought to free his hands, striking the ropes with all his might, while she watched him with eyes full of hope and fear. After several desperate attempts, he broke free. He grabbed her hand, and they fled, swimming away as the king roared behind them, ordering his guards to pursue. The depths darkened, the water growing colder, but he didn't let go. She swam swiftly, pulling him along like the wind, away from her father's grasp. He didn't know where they were headed, but he trusted her, just as she knew she had to save him as he'd saved her. Back on land, the mud hut stood quiet, but the daughters felt an unease. The eldest lingered by the door, staring at the sea with worried eyes, as if her heart whispered that her father was in peril. Part 3. The water roared around them as they swam furiously, hand in hand, fleeing the king's wrathful guards. The sea fairy pulled the fisherman behind her, slicing through the depths with a skill far beyond his human capabilities, while he struggled to keep pace, kicking against the current with a pounding heart. The darkness enveloped them, the muffled sounds of the waves blending with the distant shouts of the pursuing djinn. They had no time to think, only to swim, to escape, to survive. His body screamed with exhaustion, but he pressed on, knowing that stopping meant doom. Suddenly she halted, gripping his shoulders to steady him. They had reached a small cave hidden behind rocks draped in slimy green algae. The entrance was narrow, but they squeezed through. Inside, a faint glow emanated from stones embedded in the walls, casting a soft blue light over the space. They sat on the cave floor, still surrounded by water, yet he felt no chill or suffocation. Her hands remained on his head, granting him breath beneath the sea. He asked, panting, "Are we safe now?" She replied, catching her breath, "Not yet. But they won't find us here easily. This place is a secret, known only to a few djinn." Then, with a hint of sorrow, she added, "But my father won't stop. His anger will grow when he learns I'm carrying your child." He rubbed his forehead, trying to grasp the reality unfolding before him. He'd married her to save her, never imagining he'd become the father of a half-djinn child. "What do we do now?" he asked. She said, "We wait until his rage cools, then find a way out of this." Meanwhile, on land, the mud hut lay steeped in heavy silence. The three daughters sat together, their eyes fixed on the door with mounting dread. The eldest stood by the window, gazing at the sea, now calm from a distance. But her heart told her something was terribly wrong. She murmured to her sisters, "Don't worry, father will come soon," though her own words lacked conviction. Time stretched on. The sun had set hours ago, and still no sign of him. Dark thoughts crept into her mind. Had his boat overturned again? Was he lost at sea? Yet she'd noticed something strange in recent days, his returns with ample fish and money he'd never had before. She suspected he hid a secret, but dared not ask. Beneath the water, in the cave, guilt began to weigh on the fisherman. He said to his fairy wife, "My daughters are waiting. I can't stay here long." She looked at him with eyes full of regret and replied, "I know you love them more than me, and I don't blame you. But if you leave now, they'll catch you, and you'll die." He wavered, then said, "And if I stay, what becomes of my girls?" She took his hand and promised, "I'll find a way to get us back to land, but we must be cautious. My father won't show mercy." Just then, a faint sound approached the cave's entrance. She stiffened, signaling him to hush. One of the king's soldiers was near, probing the walls with his hand, searching for any trace. Swiftly, she pulled him to a dark corner, shielding him with her body. Her heart raced, as did his. The soldier peered inside, his gaze sweeping the dim blue glow, but saw nothing beyond it. After agonizing moments, he retreated, yet fear clung to them both. She whispered, "We can't stay here long. They'll return with more." He asked, "Where do we go?" She replied, "There's another place, far from my father's reach, but it's dangerous. It's the refuge of the outcast djinn, those who fled his rule." With no alternative, he nodded, and they swam out of the cave, diving deeper into the unknown. The journey was long, the water growing darker and colder. She swam swiftly, dragging him along, while he fought to keep his eyes open against the creeping fatigue. After hours, they reached a strange place, a city beneath the sea, but not the grand palaces she'd described. It was a ruin, its walls crumbled and draped in seaweed, faint lights flickering like ghosts amid the debris. An old djinn approached, his eyes white as if blind, yet his voice clear. "Who are you, and why come to the outcast's refuge?" She answered, "I'm the king's daughter, and this is my human husband. We're fleeing his wrath." The old djinn studied them, then said, "Enter, but know this place isn't entirely safe. The king may find you yet." They stepped into the city, greeted by wary and curious stares from the outcasts, jinn of all shapes, some with fish-like tails, others with faces melted as if by the sea. The fisherman and his wife settled in a corner, surrounded by crumbling walls. She said, "We can rest here briefly, but we need a plan." He asked, "What about your child?" She placed a hand on her belly and replied, "Our child. I'll protect it, no matter the cost." A mix of fear and duty stirred in him, yet his thoughts drifted to his daughters on land, waiting, perhaps weeping for him. That night on the shore, the eldest could bear it no longer. Wrapping an old shawl around her shoulders, she told her sisters, "I'm going to the sea. Maybe I'll find father." They tried to stop her, but she insisted. She stepped onto the beach, standing on the cold sand, calling softly, "Father, where are you?" Only the waves answered, lapping gently at her feet. She had no idea he was far beyond her reach, in a world she couldn't fathom. Beneath the sea, trouble brewed. The king had dispatched his army to scour every corner of his realm. Word reached the outcasts that the jinn were nearing their refuge. The old jinn warned the couple, "If you stay, you'll bring ruin on us all. You must leave." She looked at her husband and said, "We need to return to land, to your daughters. It's our best chance for safety." He knew the journey back wouldn't be simple, not with the king's forces hunting them, but he nodded. His longing for his girls outweighed his fear. Just then, a sound rumbled toward the ruined city. The king's army had arrived. She grabbed his hand and shouted, "Run!" But he had no legs to run with underwater, so he swam with all his strength, her pulling him once more, fleeing the death closing in. Part 4. The water churned violently around them as they swam, desperate to escape the king's army closing in on the outcasts' ruined city. The sea fairy clutched the fisherman's wrist with fierce determination, pulling him through the depths as he fought to match her pace. The sounds of the pursuing jinn grew louder, their voices like thunder muted by the sea, mingling with the rush of waves fueled by their fury. There was no time to pause, no chance to strategize, only the frantic need to flee. His muscles ached, his strength waning, but he clung to her hand, knowing she was his lifeline in this underwater nightmare. Abruptly she stopped, her eyes wide as she scanned their surroundings. They had reached a pitch-black expanse where no light pierced the gloom, the silence broken only by their ragged breathing. She whispered, "This is a place no one dares enter, not even my father's soldiers. The Black Abyss." He asked, his voice trembling, "What's the Black Abyss?" She replied, "A cursed place, they say. Those who venture in never return, but we have no choice. If they follow us here, they'll hesitate." He didn't like the sound of it, but with no other path, he nodded, and they plunged into the darkness together. The cold seeped into his bones, the blackness blinding him, yet her grip offered a flicker of comfort amid the terror. Soon, strange whispers filled the void, soft murmurs as if rising from unseen walls, though nothing but endless water surrounded them. "What's that sound?" he asked. She said, "The souls of jinn lost here. Don't fear them. As long as I'm with you, they won't touch you." But he couldn't hide the shiver that ran through him, sensing unseen eyes watching from the shadows. Meanwhile, the king's army halted at the edge of the Black Abyss. The guard captain, a towering jinn with a serpentine tail, stared into the void with uncertain eyes. He muttered to his soldiers, "No one enters the abyss and returns. Perhaps they're already dead." Unsure, he ordered sentries to stand watch at the entrance. "If they emerge, they won't escape us," he said, then returned to report to the king. The king sat on his coral throne, striking the floor with his staff in a rage that shook the sea. "If they're not dead there, I'll kill them myself," he bellowed. Deep in the abyss, the fisherman and the fairy pressed on until a faint light glimmered ahead. They approached cautiously and found a narrow passage leading to a different place. Passing through, they emerged into a vast underwater chamber, its walls studded with sparkling stones like stars, the water oddly warm. An old djinn sat on a rock, his hair white as snow, his eyes gleaming with ancient wisdom. He looked at them and said, "I haven't seen a human here in centuries. Who are you?" She replied, "I'm the king's daughter, and this is my husband. We're running from him." The old djinn smiled faintly. "I know more of your tale than you think. You've reached my sanctuary, but safety here is fleeting." They sat before him, and she recounted everything: their marriage, her father's wrath, the child she carried. He listened silently, then said, "I'm an exile, banished for defying the king long ago. I know how he thinks and his power, but I have something that might aid you." From his robe, he produced a small gold ring set with a glowing green stone. "This ancient ring offers protection from jinn for a short time," he explained. "Wear it, and you might reach land unharmed. Its power fades at sunrise." The fisherman took it, marveling at it, recalling the tales of Solomon he told his daughters. "Is this Solomon's ring?" he asked. The old djinn chuckled. "No, but it's akin to it in strength. Take it, but remember its limit." He slipped the ring onto his finger, feeling a surge of energy chase away his fear for a moment. She said, "We must go to land now, to your daughters." The old djinn agreed, pointing to a passage behind him. "Follow that. It leads to the surface. But beware, the king won't relent." They thanked him and swam toward the passage, a spark of hope growing with each stroke. The path twisted and stretched, but they pressed on, driven by the promise of safety. On land, the eldest daughter still stood on the shore. The wind tugged at her shawl, the night deepening, yet she refused to return to the hut. Her younger sisters wept inside, fearing their father was lost forever. But she remained stubborn, calling out, "Father, come back to us." Suddenly, she spotted a shadow moving in the water far off. She ran toward the waves, heedless of the cold, shouting, "Father!" The shadow vanished, and she sank to the sand, sobbing, thinking it a trick of her mind. Beneath the sea, the fisherman and fairy neared the surface, emerging in shallow waters close to the shore. The ring still shielded them, but time was slipping away. She said, "You must go now. I'll stay to stop anyone following you." He protested, "What about you and our child?" She replied, "I'll find a way to join you, but your daughters come first." Before he could argue, she pushed him upward. He broke the surface, gasping in the chilly air, and stumbled onto the beach. He stood, catching his breath, recognizing the spot a short distance from his village. He hurried toward the hut, but unbeknownst to him, the king's sentries watched from afar. The fairy lingered underwater, trying to distract any pursuers, though she felt a weakness creeping in, the strain of her pregnancy heavier than she'd expected. He reached the hut at last, bursting through the door. The younger girls slept, exhausted, but the eldest was missing. He stepped outside and found her on the shore, weeping. He ran to her, embracing her tightly, saying, "I'm here, my dear. Don't cry." She looked up, stunned, then sobbed with joy. "Where were you, father? We were so scared," she asked. He nearly spilled the truth, but the promise held him back. "I got lost at sea, but I found my way," he said, leading her back to the hut. A strange sensation in his hand made him glance at the ring. It was fading, its power nearly gone. At that moment, beneath the waves, the fairy faced new peril. A sentry had spotted her, seizing her before she could flee. He dragged her toward the king's palace as she cried, "Let me go! I'm carrying a child!" But the guard paid no heed, and the king awaited her, his eyes blazing with fury. On land, the fisherman's heart tightened, as if sensing her danger, yet he could do nothing but hold his daughters close, praying their family would reunite once more. Part 5. The fisherman sat in his mud hut, cradling his eldest daughter, while the younger two slept fitfully on the old wooden bed. The night was deep, the wind whispering outside, carrying a faint mist from the sea. His eyes lingered on the door, as if expecting someone, or something, though he wasn't sure what he hoped to see. The ring on his finger had lost its glow entirely, now a dull piece of metal, its power extinguished with the sunrise as the old djinn had warned. But his thoughts weren't on the ring. They were with his sea fairy wife, left behind in the depths, and the gnawing feeling pressing on his chest as if she were in peril. Beneath the waves she was being dragged roughly toward the king's palace. The guard who'd caught her, a tall djinn with claw-like arms, yanked her golden hair without mercy. She cried out, "Let me go, I'm carrying a child!" But her pleas faded amid the water's roar and the barked orders of other guards. She reached the palace, where the king stood before his coral throne, his eyes burning like coals, his red staff trembling in his grip with rage. He glared at her and thundered, "How dare you betray me? Married a human and bearing his child! You're no daughter of mine!" She trembled but lifted her chin defiantly. "I love him, and he's my husband. You can't change that." The king slammed his staff against the floor, shaking the palace, and roared, "I'll kill you both and erase this disgrace." But before he could act, an old djinn woman stepped from the shadows, her face etched with wrinkles, her eyes gleaming with ancient wisdom. She spoke calmly, "O king of the sea, stop. This child she carries could be a blessing or a curse to your realm. Don't rush to judgment." She was his advisor from ages past, and though his fury raged, he respected her words. He paused, then growled, "I'll keep her here until I decide her fate. As for the human, I'll find him and end him." On land, the eldest stirred in her father's arms, gazing at him with questioning eyes. "Father, you've been different since you returned. What are you hiding?" Her words nearly broke him, but he recalled the vow to the fairy, reveal the secret, and a curse would fall. He forced a faint smile and said, "Nothing, my dear, just the weariness of fishing." She didn't fully believe him. She saw the worry in his eyes, the way he glanced at the sea during every quiet moment. That night, sleep eluded him. He felt compelled to act, though he knew not how. Rising from the bed, he stepped onto the shore, standing where his daughter had stood. He stared at the water and whispered, "Where are you? Are you safe?" He expected no reply, but the words needed release. Then, a faint light flickered beneath the waves near the shore. He edged closer, and there she was, the fairy, her head breaking the surface, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "They caught me, but I escaped," she said weakly. "My father's hunting you now, and he's coming." His heart leapt. "How did you get away?" he asked. She replied, "The old advisor helped me. She gave me a chance to slip free, but she can't protect me long. We need a safe place." He took her hand, helping her from the water. She shivered, her pregnancy now faintly visible. "I'll take you to the hut," he said. "But what about my daughters? I can't tell them the truth." She nodded. "Not yet. Let me stay with you. We'll figure it out together." He led her to the hut under cover of darkness, sneaking her through the back door. The girl slept, so he tucked her into a corner, draping an old blanket over her. She looked frail, yet her eyes still shone with a hidden strength. "The king won't stop," she said, "but he can't easily breach the land. We're safe here for now." He wasn't convinced, knowing her father's wrath would find a way. Morning came, and the girls awoke. The eldest spotted the fairy in the corner and gasped, "Father, who's this?" He froze, scrambling for a lie. "She's a poor woman I found on the shore, needing help," he said. The eldest eyed her suspiciously but said nothing, helping her father prepare food for the stranger. The fairy stayed quiet, hiding her nature, though her golden hair and unearthly beauty raised doubts. The youngest said innocently, "She looks like a princess from your stories." "Father!" He laughed nervously. "Maybe she is." But peace was short-lived. That night, the wind battered the hut with unnatural force. Waves rose high, crashing against the shore as if trying to invade the land. He felt dread, and the fairy confirmed it. "It's my father. He's found us." He stepped outside and saw strange shadows moving in the water, a jinn army approaching. Rushing back, he said, "We have to run." But she shook her head. "There's nowhere to flee now. We must face him." He woke the girls, saying, "We're going somewhere safe in the village." But before they could leave, the door burst open, and the king stormed in, surrounded by a halo of frozen water as if he'd brought the sea with him. His form loomed large, his eyes promising death. "Where's my daughter?" he roared. "I'll end this now." The fairy stepped forward, shielding her husband and his daughters, and cried, "You won't harm them while I live." The king laughed bitterly. "I'll kill you all, and no trace of this shame will remain." Despair gripped the fisherman, but he noticed something in his eldest's hand, the faded ring that had slipped from his finger unnoticed. She whispered, "Father, can this ring help us?" Unsure, he took it, raising it high and shouting, "If you've any power left, save us!" A faint glow pulsed from it, not as strong as before, but enough to make the king flinch back. It bought them a moment. The fairy seized the chance, lunging at her father with all her strength. Weak as she was, her love for her husband and child fueled her. She struck him, and he stumbled, but rose swiftly, grabbing her throat. The fisherman yelled, "Let her go!" and charged, only for the guards to seize him and the girls. The situation was dire, death looming, but the fairy met her husband's gaze with eyes full of hope and whispered, "Trust me." Part 6. The mud hut quaked under the weight of the king and his guards, as if the earth itself trembled before his rage. The sea fairy dangled from her father's grip, his powerful hand around her throat, while the fisherman shouted, "Let her go!" struggling against the guards who pinned him and his 3 daughters. The eldest wept, clutching her younger sisters, her eyes wide with terror at the strange beings invading their simple world. Yet amid the chaos, the fairy's last words echoed in the fisherman's ears, "Trust me." He didn't know her plan, but he clung to those words like a lifeline in the storm. The king lifted her higher, poised to crush her, his face twisted with fury, his eyes glowing like embers under the moonlight streaming through the broken window. But he froze when he felt a faint stir against his grasp. The child within her moved, a silent reminder of what he was about to destroy. He faltered, shaken by her gaze, which hid a resolve he'd never seen in her before. Gasping, she said, "If you kill me, you'll kill your only heir who'd carry your name." Her words struck like an arrow through his armor. He lowered her slowly to the floor, though his hand lingered on her neck as a warning. Turning to the fisherman, he snarled, "This human started it all. I'll end him and save you from this madness." She screamed, "No, he's my husband, the father of my child. Harm him, and I'll follow him to death." Her voice carried a strength he hadn't expected, as if her love for the fisherman and his daughters had forged a courage surpassing even the jinn's might. Then, something extraordinary happened. The faded ring in the fisherman's hand flickered to life, not with the brilliance it once had, but with a soft pulse, like a beating heart. Forgotten in the panic, it now warmed his palm. Instinctively he raised it, and the dim light struck the king's eyes, forcing him to stagger back and release the fairy. The fisherman seized the moment, rushing to her side and pulling her behind him as the guards hesitated, confused by the strange glow. She stepped forward, placing herself between her husband, his daughters, and her father, raising her hands and crying out, "Enough! I'm your daughter, and these are my family. If you want to kill us, do it, but you'll lose everything." Her voice blended power and desperation, as if she'd poured her entire life into those words. The king stopped, staring at her long and hard. Rage still churned within him, but something in her eyes, perhaps a flicker of her lost mother, made him waver. "How can I let this disgrace stand?" he growled. She took a step closer. "It's not disgrace. It's a gift. This child will unite our worlds, a bridge between humans and jinn. Don't you want a legacy worth remembering?" Her words seeped into his heart, planting a seed he'd never considered. He shook his head. "I can't accept a human in my lineage." But before he could move, small footsteps approached. The eldest daughter let go of her sisters and stood beside the fairy, grasping her hand firmly. "If she's your family, she's ours too," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. "Don't hurt her, or my father." That moment was the final blow to the king's resolve. He looked at the girl, then the fisherman, then his daughter standing as a shield. For the first time he seemed to see beyond his anger. Lowering his staff, he said, "If you're set on this, I won't kill you. But this human will never be part of my kingdom." She replied, "We don't want your kingdom, just to live together." He gazed at her a while longer, then signaled his guards. "Back to the sea. I'll leave them, but this is our last meeting." The king and his guards departed, leaving the hut in a heavy silence. The water they'd brought drained from the walls, taking the terror with it. The fisherman sank to his knees, breathing hard, as the fairy embraced him, tears streaming down her face. The three daughters rushed to them, wrapping their arms around their father and his mysterious wife, accepting her without words. The eldest said, "Father, tell us the truth now." He glanced at the fairy, who nodded. The secret was already half revealed. Sitting with them, he told the whole tale, from the stormy day he met her underwater to the moment she saved them. The girls listened, eyes wide, as if living one of his bedtime stories, now real. The youngest asked, "So, we'll have a little brother who's half jinn?" He smiled. "Yes, my dear, and he'll be part of us." The eldest looked at the fairy and said, "If you're father's wife, you're our mother now." Those words were like cool water to the fairy's soul. She wept with joy, hugging the girl tightly. In the days that followed, life settled into a new rhythm, subtly transformed. The fairy stayed with them in the hut, adapting to land with her husband and daughter's help. She weakened at times, away from the sea, but went to the shore at night to regain her strength, returning with fish alongside the fisherman. Poverty no longer loomed over them. She brought small treasures from the depths, gold coins and precious shells, enough to improve their lives without drawing the villagers' suspicion. Months later, the child was born on a quiet night. A boy, his hair golden like his mother's, his eyes sparkling with a human warmth like his father's, a wondrous blend of both worlds. He laughed, filling the hut with a warmth that chased away old shadows. They named him Light, for he brightened their lives after so much darkness. The king never returned, though the fairies sensed he watched from afar, perhaps waiting to see his grandson, or letting his anger fade with time. Each night, the fisherman sat with his family, weaving new tales, not just of Solomon, but of his own adventures with the fairy. The girls listened, enthralled, and she added details from her world, making the stories more magical. One night, the youngest asked, "Father, did you ever find the ring's fish?" He laughed. "No, my dear, but I found a greater treasure, my family." The mud hut brimmed with life, the love binding them stronger than any curse or wrath. The fisherman looked at his wife, daughters, and son, feeling every trial had been worth this end. On the shore, the sea grew calm, as if blessing their peace, far from the dark depths, beneath an open sky and twinkling stars.